As the elevator doors were closing, Dr. Hale looked at me one last time, and with that humiliating smirk on his lips, he said, "When you make a mistake and kill someone tonight, I will personally burn your nursing license, Julia." He abandoned me in Philadelphia's busiest trauma center without a single doctor, right in the middle of a deadly shift. His plan was flawless. I would panic, lose the patients, and by morning I would be fired in disgrace. But there was one thing Dr. Hale hadn't calculated. Only a doctor walked out of those doors that night, but the person who remained inside was stronger than an army. He had no idea who would be walking out of that hospital with their head down when morning came. That night, I didn't just bring 3 people back from the dead. I also taught that arrogant ego who told me, "You can't do it," the lesson of a lifetime. Don't go anywhere until you hear what happened, because justice has never been this sweet. After all those years in the ER at Philadelphia Memorial Hospital, I had gotten used to the smell of blood, the screams, and that strange silence in the middle of chaos. I'm Julia Bennett. I love my job. I could even say I'm passionate about it, but to Dr. Alex Hale, I was just a nurse who needed to know her place. Alex knew I was talented, and that was exactly the problem. The fact that my diagnoses were faster than his, and that patients felt safer talking to me, cracked his fragile ego a little more every day. And that night was the breaking point. It was around 02 hours a.m. He cut off my suggestion regarding a critical patient in front of the entire team, the interns, and even the patient's relatives, deliberately raising his voice. "Medical decisions are made by doctors, Julia. You are a nurse whose only duty is to follow orders. Now step back and let me do my job." Everyone froze. I felt my face burning, but I maintained my professionalism. However, Alex wasn't finished yet. He grabbed the shift roster, sent the other doctor home under the excuse of an emergency, then grabbed his coat and turned to me. "Since you know so much," he whispered, "tonight, this place is your kingdom. Let's see if those instincts you trust so much can save you in a real crisis." And he left. He left me alone during the city's most dangerous hours, in the middle of a protocol where I couldn't even administer medication without a doctor's approval. The first 10 minutes were silent. I thought maybe he was bluffing. Maybe he would come back. But then, that sound was heard. That crackling announcement from the radio heralded the start of the nightmare. "Central, multiple trauma inbound, ETA 3 minutes, 3 critical victims." When the double doors swung open, hell itself entered. As the gurneys were rolled in one after another, decisions had to be made in seconds. And when I looked around, I realized that terrifying truth once again. There was no one. On the first gurney was Ethan Wallace, 29 years old, shot in the chest, covered in blood. His pulse was thready. Right behind him was Linda Marshall, 54 years old, a clear heart attack picture, trembling with a deadly rhythm on the monitor. And on the third gurney, 22-year-old young athlete Amber Collins. Her breathing had completely stopped. Her face was starting to turn purple. 3 lives, 3 seconds, 0 doctors. There was every reason to panic, but I didn't panic because there was one thing Dr. Alex Hale hadn't considered when he abandoned me here. I had been doing this job for 10 years, and I had learned to survive Philadelphia's most brutal shifts. Yes, there was no doctor, but there was knowledge, there was experience, and most importantly, there was an unwavering will. I immediately grabbed the radio and called the in-hospital emergency code, but there was no response. That's when I realized Alex had silenced the phones. Backup doctors weren't receiving calls, resident physicians were unreachable, and the administrative team was at minimum capacity during the night shift. I was truly alone, but I wasn't helpless. I quickly assessed all 3 patients and made a mental priority list. Ethan was losing blood fast. If I didn't stop that bleeding in the next 2 minutes, he would go into hypovolemic shock and his organs would start shutting down. Linda's heart was in a dangerous arrhythmia. One wrong move, and she could flatline. Amber wasn't breathing at all. Her brain was being deprived of oxygen with every passing second. I had to save all three, and I had to do it now. I started with Ethan because he was the most unstable. I ripped open his shirt and saw the bullet entry wound on his left chest. The bleeding was massive and pulsatile, which meant an artery was hit. I grabbed the largest gauze packs we had and applied direct pressure with all my strength. Ethan's eyes rolled back. His pulse was fading. I yelled at him, "Ethan, stay with me. You're not dying tonight. Do you hear me?" I don't know if he heard me, but I needed to say it. I needed to believe it myself. While keeping pressure on Ethan's wound with one hand, I reached over to Linda's gurney with the other and checked her monitor. Ventricular tachycardia, rate over 180, blood pressure dropping fast. She needed cardioversion immediately, but I couldn't leave Ethan or he would bleed out. That's when I did something that would probably cost me my license if anyone found out. I made a medical decision without a doctor's order. I grabbed the defibrillator, set it to synchronized cardioversion mode, charged it to 100 joules, and while still holding pressure on Ethan's wound, I placed the paddles on Linda's chest. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "Linda, I need you to hold on. This is going to hurt, but it's going to save your life." I pressed the button. Linda's body jerked violently. The monitor beeped erratically, and for one terrible second, I thought I had killed her. But then her rhythm converted. Her heart rate dropped to 1 to 10, and her blood pressure started climbing. She gasped and opened her eyes. 1 down, 2 to go. But Amber still wasn't breathing, and Ethan was still bleeding through my gauze packs. I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, but there was no help coming. That's when I heard footsteps running down the hallway, and for one hopeful moment, I thought maybe someone had finally responded to my calls. But it wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was Marcus, our 19-year-old ER transporter who was supposed to be on his break. He saw the chaos, saw me covered in blood trying to manage 3 dying patients, and without hesitation he asked, "What do you need me to do?" I had never been so grateful to see anyone in my entire life. I quickly gave him instructions. "Marcus, I need you to bag Amber. Do you remember the training? Squeeze the bag once every 5 seconds. Watch her chest rise. Don't stop until I tell you." Marcus was terrified, but he nodded and grabbed the bag valve mask, positioning himself at Amber's head and starting to ventilate her. That freed me to focus on Ethan, whose bleeding still hadn't stopped. I applied more pressure, elevated his legs to maintain blood flow to his vital organs, and started 2 large-bore IVs to pump fluids into him. His pressure was barely holding at 70 systolic. His skin was cold and clammy, and I knew he needed surgery immediately or he wouldn't make it. But the nearest surgeon was at least 20 minutes away, and Ethan didn't have 20 minutes. I had to do something radical, something I had only seen done in extreme combat medicine situations. I grabbed the ultrasound machine, quickly scanned his chest, and confirmed what I suspected. There was blood accumulating in his chest cavity, a hemothorax that was compressing his lung and his heart. He needed a chest tube, and he needed it now. But inserting a chest tube was a surgical procedure, something only doctors were authorized to do, something that could land me in prison if I did it without proper credentials. I looked at Ethan's face, at his lips turning blue, at the monitor showing his pressure dropping to 60, and I made my decision. I grabbed the chest tube kit, prepped his side with betadine, found the landmark between his ribs, and made the incision. My hands moved with a confidence I didn't know I possessed, guided by years of watching procedures and secretly studying surgical techniques. I pushed the tube through the tissue layers, felt it pop into the chest cavity, and immediately dark red blood started draining into the collection chamber. Ethan's pressure started climbing, his color started improving, and he took a deep, gasping breath. 2 down, 1 to go. But just as I was celebrating that small victory, Linda's monitor started alarming again. Her heart rhythm was deteriorating. She was going back into that deadly arrhythmia, and this time it looked even worse. She was going into ventricular fibrillation, the rhythm that meant her heart was just quivering uselessly instead of pumping blood. She was coding, and I had maybe 90 seconds before her brain damage became irreversible. I ran to Linda's side and started CPR immediately, pushing hard and fast on her chest, while Marcus continued bagging Amber in the corner. I counted compressions out loud, trying to keep my rhythm steady, even though my arms were already burning from exhaustion. After 30 compressions, I checked the monitor and saw she was still in VL fib. So I grabbed the defibrillator again, charged it to 200 joules this time, and shocked her. Her body lifted off the gurney and fell back down, but the rhythm didn't change. I went back to compressions, pushing even harder, feeling her ribs flexing under my hands and praying I wasn't breaking them. Another 30 compressions, another shock at 300 joules, and still nothing. I was losing her, and I knew it. That's when I remembered something from a cardiology conference I had attended last year, something about refractory V-fib and alternative medication protocols. We had amiodarone in the crash cart, but we also had magnesium sulfate, and in certain types of arrhythmias caused by electrolyte imbalances, magnesium could work when nothing else did. It was a gamble, but Linda was dying anyway, so I pushed a dose of magnesium through her IV while continuing compressions. 30 more compressions, one more shock at 360 joules, and this time her rhythm converted. Her heart started beating again, weak but steady, and her blood pressure came back. I almost collapsed with relief, but there was no time to celebrate because Amber still wasn't breathing on her own. Marcus had been bagging her for almost 10 minutes, and his arms were getting tired. Plus, I knew we couldn't keep this up forever. Amber needed to be intubated. She needed a breathing tube placed in her airway so we could connect her to a ventilator. But intubation was another procedure that only doctors were supposed to perform. I had practiced on mannequins dozens of times during training, and I had assisted with hundreds of real intubations, but I had never actually done one myself. My hands were shaking as I gathered the equipment: the laryngoscope, the endotracheal tube, the stylet, the syringe to inflate the cuff. Marcus looked at me with worried eyes and asked if I was sure I could do this, and I told him I had to be sure, because the alternative was watching Amber die. I positioned myself at the head of Amber's gurney, opened her mouth, inserted the laryngoscope blade, and lifted her tongue to visualize her vocal cords. But I couldn't see them. There was too much secretion, too much swelling, and my angle was wrong. I repositioned, tried again, and this time I caught a glimpse of the cords just as they were starting to close. I pushed the tube through the opening, advanced it until I felt resistance, pulled out the stylet, and inflated the cuff. Then I connected the bag and squeezed, watching Amber's chest to see if it would rise. It did, and when I listened with my stethoscope, I heard breath sounds in both lungs. The tube was in the right place. Amber was breathing, and all 3 of my patients were alive. I wanted to cry, I wanted to scream, I wanted to collapse on the floor and never get up, but instead I just stood there covered in blood and sweat, staring at the monitors and making sure all 3 rhythms stayed stable. That's when I heard voices coming from the hallway, and this time it really was help arriving. 2 paramedics rushed in with another patient, took one look at the scene, and their jaws dropped. They saw Ethan with a chest tube, draining blood, Linda recovering from a code, Amber intubated and on a ventilator, and me standing in the middle of it all like some kind of blood-soaked warrior. One of them asked where the doctor was, and I just shook my head and told them there was no doctor, there was only me. They couldn't believe it. They actually argued with me, insisting that someone must have helped. But Marcus backed me up and confirmed that I had done everything alone. The paramedics immediately called for backup, and within minutes the hospital administration was alerted that something very wrong had happened in the ER. But I didn't care about the politics or the consequences right then. All I cared about was making sure my 3 patients stayed stable until proper help arrived. The backup doctor finally showed up about 15 minutes later, a sleepy-looking resident who had been pulled from his on-call room and clearly had no idea what he was walking into. I gave him a rapid-fire report on all 3 patients, explaining every intervention I had done and every medication I had given, and I watched his face go pale as he realized the scope of what had happened. He asked me 3 times if I was really saying I had placed a chest tube and intubated a patient without supervision, and each time I confirmed yes, that's exactly what I did, because the alternative was letting them die. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just started examining the patients and confirming that my interventions had actually worked. Ethan's bleeding had stopped, his chest tube was draining appropriately, and his vital signs were stabilizing. Linda's heart rhythm was holding steady, her blood pressure was normal, and she was even starting to wake up and talk. Amber was breathing comfortably on the ventilator, her oxygen levels were perfect, and her neurological responses were intact. All 3 patients were not just alive, they were actually doing well, and the resident had to admit that my emergency interventions had probably saved their lives. But saving their lives didn't mean I was safe from consequences. In fact, I knew I was probably in the biggest trouble of my career. What I had done was technically illegal, practicing medicine without a license, performing procedures I wasn't certified for, making decisions that could have killed people if I had been. Wrong. The hospital administration was going to crucify me, the medical board was going to investigate me, and Dr. Alex Hale was going to use this as proof that I was a dangerous rogue nurse who needed to be fired immediately. I expected all of that. I was prepared for all of that, but what I wasn't prepared for was what happened next. As the resident was stabilizing my patients and I was cleaning up the blood-soaked ER, Linda Marshall suddenly reached out and grabbed my hand. Her voice was weak, but her words were strong. "You saved my life, didn't you? When there was no doctor here, you saved all of us." Tears started running down her face, and then down mine too, and I couldn't find words to respond, so I just squeezed her hand and nodded. Then Ethan, who was barely conscious but apparently aware enough to understand what had happened, whispered, "Thank you. I heard you telling me not to die. I held on because you told me to." And even Amber, who couldn't talk because of the breathing tube, looked at me with eyes full of gratitude and mouthed the words, "Thank you," so clearly that my heart almost broke. These 3 people were alive because I refused to give up, because I broke rules and took risks and did things I wasn't supposed to do. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what punishment came next, it was worth it. But the night wasn't over yet, because at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as the sun was starting to rise over Philadelphia, the elevator doors opened and Dr. Alex Hale walked back into the ER, expecting to find chaos and failure and proof that I was incompetent. Instead, he found 3 stable patients, a crowd of witnesses, and me standing there waiting for him with the calmest expression I could manage. The look on Alex's face when he saw that all 3 patients were alive was something I will remember for the rest of my life. His confident smirk vanished instantly, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear. He walked slowly through the ER, checking the monitors, reading the charts, examining the chest tube I had placed and the intubation I had performed, and with each passing second, his face got paler. The resident who had arrived as backup was still there, and he walked up to Alex with a very serious expression and said, "Dr. Hale, we need to talk about what happened here tonight, and more importantly, we need to talk about why there was no attending physician present during a critical mass casualty event." Alex tried to brush it off, claiming he had been called away for an emergency and had tried to get coverage but couldn't reach anyone. But the resident wasn't buying it. Neither were the paramedics who had witnessed the aftermath, or Marcus, who had seen everything from the beginning, or the nurses from the morning shift who were arriving and hearing the story. Within an hour, the entire hospital knew what had happened, and the narrative wasn't what Alex had planned. He had expected people to hear that Julia Bennett had been overwhelmed and made fatal mistakes. Instead, they were hearing that Julia Bennett had single-handedly saved 3 lives, while the attending physician had deliberately abandoned his post. The hospital administrator arrived at 08:00 a.m., a stern woman named Dr. Patricia Morgan, who had a reputation for not tolerating any nonsense from anyone. She called Alex and me into a conference room, and I genuinely didn't know if I was about to be fired or arrested or both. Dr. Morgan sat down, folded her hands on the table, and asked Alex to explain why he had left the ER without proper coverage during peak trauma hours. Alex stammered through some excuse about a personal emergency and a miscommunication with the scheduling system, but Dr. Morgan cut him off and told him she had already reviewed the security footage, the phone logs, and the witness statements, and it was very clear that he had left deliberately and had ignored multiple calls trying to reach him. Then she turned to me and asked me to explain exactly what procedures I had performed and what medications I had administered without a physician's order. I took a deep breath and told her everything, not trying to minimize or justify, just stating the facts of what I did and why I did it. I placed a chest tube because the patient had a tension hemothorax and would have died without it. I performed cardioversion and administered cardiac medications because the patient was in lethal arrhythmia and would have died without it. I performed endotracheal intubation because the patient had respiratory failure and would have died without it. I broke protocol, I exceeded my scope of practice, I did things I wasn't licensed to do, and I took full responsibility for all of it. When I finished talking, Dr. Morgan was silent for a long moment, and then she asked me one simple question. "Nurse Bennett, do you believe you made the right choices?" I looked her straight in the eye and said yes, I made the only choices I could live with, because letting 3 people die to protect my license would have been something I couldn't live with. Dr. Morgan nodded slowly, made some notes, and then dismissed us both, saying she would make her decision after consulting with the medical board and the legal department. I left that conference room fully expecting to be fired within the week, and honestly, I had made peace with it. I had saved 3 lives. I had proven to myself that I could handle the impossible, and no one could take that away from me, no matter what happened next. But what happened next was nothing like what I expected. Over the following days, my 3 patients continued to recover beautifully. Ethan's chest tube was removed after 48 hours. His lung re-expanded fully, and he was transferred out of ICU. Linda's heart stabilized completely. She underwent a cardiac catheterization that placed 2 stents, and she was walking around the cardiac unit within 3 days. Amber was extubated after 36 hours. Her neurological function was completely intact, with no signs of brain damage from the respiratory arrest, and she was already talking about when she could get back to training. 3 people who should have died that night were instead making full recoveries, and their families wanted to know who had saved them. When they found out it was a nurse working alone without any doctor support, they were shocked, and then they were angry, and then they started making noise. Ethan's father was a journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he wrote a detailed article about what had happened that night, praising my actions and questioning why an attending physician had abandoned the ER during a crisis. Linda's husband was a lawyer, and he started asking very pointed questions about hospital policies and physician oversight. Amber's parents contacted the local news station, and suddenly there were TV cameras outside the hospital wanting to interview the nurse who had saved 3 lives in one impossible night. The hospital administration tried to control the narrative, issuing careful statements about reviewing procedures and ensuring proper coverage. But the story had already taken on a life of its own. Social media picked it up. Medical forums started debating it, and nursing organizations began citing it as an example of the critical role nurses play in emergency care. Within a week, I went from being a nurse who expected to lose her license to being someone who was being called a hero, and I didn't know how to feel about any of it. But the most important moment came 10 days after that terrible night, when Dr. Patricia Morgan called me into her office again. This time she wasn't alone. She was joined by the chief of medicine, the head of nursing, and 2 representatives from the state medical board. I sat down preparing for the worst, but instead Dr. Morgan smiled at me and said, "Nurse Bennett, After extensive review of the events of that night, including examination of all medical records, interviews with all witnesses, and consultation with multiple clinical experts, we have reached our conclusion." She paused, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. And then she continued, "Your actions that night were extraordinary. You faced an impossible situation created by the negligence of an attending physician, and you made decisions that saved 3 lives. While we cannot officially condone a nurse performing procedures outside her licensed scope of practice, we recognize that you acted in good faith under extreme duress, and that your clinical judgment was sound. Therefore, no disciplinary action will be taken against you. Furthermore, we are creating a new protocol to ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else again." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No disciplinary action, no license suspension, no termination, nothing. Instead, they were acknowledging that I had done the right thing, and they were changing hospital policy because of it. But Dr. Morgan wasn't finished yet. She looked at me with an expression that was almost proud and continued. "Additionally, the hospital board has approved funding for an advanced practice nursing program that will allow experienced ER nurses to receive additional training and certification in emergency procedures. You will be the first nurse enrolled in this program, and upon completion, you will be authorized to perform many of the interventions you did that night, but with proper legal backing and institutional support. We are also pleased to inform you that you are being promoted to Senior Emergency Nurse Specialist, with a significant salary increase and a leadership role in training other nurses." I sat there stunned, barely able to process what was happening. Not only was I not being punished, I was being rewarded, promoted, and given the opportunity to help other nurses develop the skills that had saved 3 lives. It felt surreal, like I was in some kind of dream, but then the head of nursing reached across the table and shook my hand, and I knew it was real. Of course, there was one more piece of business to address, and Dr. Morgan's expression turned serious again as she brought it up. As for Dr. Alex Hale, his case has been reviewed separately. The evidence clearly shows that he deliberately abandoned his post, ignored emergency calls, and created a dangerous situation that endangered patient lives. His actions constitute gross negligence and a violation of his ethical duties as a physician. Effective immediately, Dr. Hale has been terminated from his position at this hospital, his privileges have been revoked, and a formal complaint has been filed with the state medical board regarding his fitness to practice medicine. The satisfaction I felt hearing those words was immense, but it was also complicated. I didn't want to be the person who ended someone's career, even someone who had treated me terribly. But at the same time, I knew that Alex's actions that night could have killed people. He had gambled with human lives just to prove a point about hierarchy and ego, and there had to be consequences for that. As I left Dr. Morgan's office that day, I felt like I was walking on air. Everything had changed in just 10 days, and it had changed in ways I never could have imagined. But the real validation came later that afternoon, when I returned to the ER for my next shift. My colleagues greeted me with applause. Patients and families who had heard the story thanked me, and even some of the doctors who used to dismiss me now treated me with genuine respect. The culture was shifting, slowly but noticeably, and I had played a part in that shift. About 2 weeks after everything happened, I received a message asking me to come to the ICU because someone wanted to see me. When I arrived, I found all 3 of my patients waiting there together. Ethan was sitting up in a wheelchair. Linda was standing with her husband, and Amber was there with her parents. They had coordinated this meeting without telling me, and when I walked in, they all started talking at once, thanking me and telling me how grateful they were and saying that I had given them their lives back. Ethan told me that he was a veteran who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan only to nearly die on the streets of Philadelphia, and that my refusal to give up on him had reminded him why life was worth fighting for. Linda told me that she had been feeling chest pain for days, but kept ignoring it because she was too busy taking care of everyone else, and that her brush with death had taught her to value her own health and her own life. Amber told me that she had dreams of competing in the Olympics, and that I had saved not just her life, but her future, and that she would carry my example with her forever. Their words meant more to me than any promotion or recognition from the hospital, because they reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place. It wasn't about status or authority or proving anything to doctors like Alex Hale. It was about being there for people in their darkest moments and doing everything possible to bring them back to the light. But the story doesn't end there, because about a month later, I heard through the hospital grapevine that Dr. Alex Hale's life had completely fallen apart. After being fired from our hospital, he'd tried to get a position at several other medical centers, but word had spread about what he did, and no one wanted to hire him. The state medical board had launched a formal investigation, and while they ultimately decided not to revoke his license entirely, they did suspend it for 6 months and required him to complete ethics training and anger management counseling before he could practice again. His reputation in the medical community was destroyed, and even after his suspension ended, the only job he could find was at a small rural clinic far from any major city. I heard that he tried to reach out to me once through a mutual acquaintance with some kind of apology or explanation, but I never responded. Some people might think I should have been more forgiving, but I couldn't forget that he had been willing to let patients die just to humiliate me, and that wasn't something I could accept or excuse. His career destruction wasn't something I celebrated, but it also wasn't something I felt guilty about, because he had done it to himself through his own choices. Meanwhile, my own career continued to flourish in ways I never anticipated. The advanced practice program I enrolled in was intensive and challenging, covering everything from advanced pharmacology to emergency surgical procedures to critical care protocols. I spent 6 months in additional training, learning from some of the best emergency physicians in the country, and when I completed the program, I became one of the first emergency nurse practitioners in Pennsylvania with expanded practice authority. This meant I could now legally perform many of the procedures I had done that desperate night, including chest tube placement, endotracheal intubation, central line insertion, and even some minor surgical repairs. I could order medications, interpret diagnostic tests, and make clinical decisions with a level of autonomy that most nurses never achieved. It was everything I had ever wanted professionally, and it came about because I had been forced to prove myself under the worst possible circumstances. But beyond my own career advancement, something even more important happened. The story of that night became a catalyst for change throughout the hospital system. Administration realized that they had been systematically undervaluing and underutilizing their nursing staff, and they began implementing programs to recognize nurses' clinical expertise and expand their roles in patient care. The old hierarchical model where doctors made all the decisions and nurses just followed orders started breaking down, replaced by a more collaborative approach where everyone's clinical input was valued based on their knowledge and experience rather than their title. Other hospitals in the region heard about our program and started developing their own versions, and within 2 years, there was a whole network of emergency nurse practitioners across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. We'd created something bigger than ourselves, a movement that recognized nurses not as doctor assistants, but as independent clinicians with unique and valuable skills. I also started speaking at nursing conferences and medical seminars, sharing the story of that night and talking about the importance of empowering nurses to use their full clinical knowledge. Some people in the medical establishment pushed back, arguing that I was promoting dangerous scope creep and undermining physician authority. But most people recognized that healthcare was changing and that rigid hierarchies were becoming obsolete. The reality was that patients benefited when every member of the care team was empowered to contribute their expertise, and that collaborative care produced better outcomes than authoritarian control. About 6 months after that life-changing night, I was working an evening shift when I saw a familiar face in the waiting room, and my heart stopped for a moment. It was Dr. Alex Hale, but he looked completely different from the arrogant physician I remembered. He had lost weight, his face was drawn and tired, and his expensive designer clothes had been replaced with a simple button-down shirt and worn jeans. He wasn't there as a doctor. He was there accompanying an elderly woman who I assumed was his mother, based on their similar features. When he saw me, his expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, shame, fear, and finally resignation. He clearly wanted to avoid me, but the waiting room was crowded and there was nowhere to hide, so we ended up making awkward eye contact across the space. I could have ignored him, could have pretended I didn't see him, but something made me walk over to where he was sitting. His mother was holding her chest and breathing heavily, clearly having some kind of cardiac issue, and despite everything that had happened between Alex and me, I couldn't ignore a patient in distress. I knelt down next to the elderly woman and introduced myself, asking about her symptoms while Alex sat there frozen and silent. She told me she had been having chest pain and shortness of breath for about an hour, and when I checked her vital signs, I saw that her heart rate was elevated and her oxygen saturation was low. This was serious and she needed to be seen immediately, but the ER was backed up and the wait time was over 2 hours. Under normal circumstances, I would have just flagged her as high priority and moved on. But looking at Alex's face, seeing the genuine fear and helplessness there, I made a decision. I told him to bring his mother through the staff entrance, and I personally escorted them to an available bed in the back of the ER, bypassing the entire waiting system. Alex looked at me with confusion and something that might have been gratitude, and he whispered, "Why are you helping me? After what I did to you, you have every reason to let my mother wait." I looked at him and said something I had been thinking about for months. "I'm not helping you, Alex. I'm helping her. She's a patient who needs care, and that's all that matters. What happened between us doesn't change my duty to help people, and if you ever understood that principle, you wouldn't have abandoned the ER that night." He flinched like I had slapped him, but he didn't argue, and I got to work taking care of his mother. It turned out she was having an acute heart failure exacerbation, probably triggered by stopping her medications because they were too expensive. We got her stabilized, admitted her to cardiology, and connected her with social services to help with medication costs. Through the whole process, Alex sat quietly in the corner of the room, watching me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. When his mother was finally settled and comfortable, he approached me one more time and said, "Julia, I need to say this even though I know it doesn't fix anything. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong to belittle you, wrong to abandon the ER, wrong to let my ego and insecurity turn me into someone who put patients at risk. When I heard that you saved those 3 people that night, my first reaction wasn't shame, it was anger. Because you had proven that everything I believed about hierarchy and authority was false. But over these past months, watching my career fall apart and realizing that I destroyed it through my own arrogance, I finally understood something. You were never trying to challenge me or take my place. You were just trying to be the best nurse you could be, and I was too insecure to handle that. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that you changed me and probably saved me in a way that's different from how you saved those patients." I didn't know what to say to that because part of me was still angry at him, and part of me felt something like pity for how far he had fallen. Finally, I just said, "Alex, I hope you figure out who you want to be as a doctor, because the person who walked out those elevator doors that night isn't someone who should be practicing medicine, but the person sitting here worried about his mother. That person might still have a chance to do something meaningful with his career." He nodded, thanked me again, and left to sit with his mother. I never saw him again after that night, but I heard later that he had completely changed his approach to medicine. After his suspension ended, he took a position at a community health clinic serving underserved populations, working for a fraction of his previous salary and focusing on patients who had nowhere else to go. Some people said he was just trying to rehabilitate his image, but others said he seemed genuinely different, more humble and more focused on actual patient care than on status and hierarchy. I didn't know which version was true, and honestly, I didn't care that much, because my focus was on moving forward rather than looking back. The advanced practice program had opened so many doors for me, and I was building a career that was more fulfilling than I had ever imagined possible. I was teaching other nurses, developing new protocols, contributing to research on emergency care outcomes, and most importantly, I was taking care of patients with a level of skill and authority that felt right. But the best moment came about a year after that terrible night, during a hospital-wide meeting where they were announcing various awards and recognitions. I wasn't expecting anything. I was just there because attendance was mandatory, but then Dr. Patricia Morgan called my name and asked me to come to the front of the auditorium. She proceeded to tell the story of that night, not holding back any details about how I had been abandoned by an attending physician and forced to save 3 lives alone. She talked about the chest tube placement, the cardioversion, the intubation, and the courage it took to make those decisions knowing they could cost me my career. Then she presented me with the hospital's highest honor, the Exceptional Care Award, which came with a crystal trophy and a check for $10,000. But more important than the trophy or the money was what she said next. Julia Bennett represents everything this hospital should aspire to be. She put patients first, she used her knowledge and skills fearlessly, and she showed us that great healthcare isn't about titles or hierarchy. It's about competence, compassion, and courage. Every doctor, every nurse, every person in this building should look at Julia's example and ask themselves if they would have the strength to do what she did. The entire auditorium stood and applauded, and I saw tears in the eyes of some of my colleagues who knew how close I had come to losing everything. It was overwhelming and humbling and validating all at once, and in that moment I felt like everything I had been through was worth it. After the ceremony, dozens of people came up to congratulate me, including several doctors who admitted they had previously looked down on nurses, but now realized how wrong they had been. Even some of the old guard physicians who still clung to traditional hierarchies seemed to regard me with a new level of respect, even if they didn't entirely agree with the expansion of nursing roles. But the most meaningful moment came later that evening, when I was leaving the hospital and saw 3 people waiting by my car. It was Ethan, Linda, and Amber, my 3 patients from that impossible night, and they had all coordinated to be there for the ceremony. They had watched from the back of the auditorium, and now they wanted to thank me one more time and tell me what their lives had been like since that night. Ethan told me he had used his journalism background to start a nonprofit focused on trauma care education and had named it after the date of that night. Linda told me she had become an advocate for women's heart health and was speaking at community centers about recognizing cardiac symptoms. Amber told me she had made the Olympic team and would be competing in track and field in the next summer games, and that she planned to dedicate her performance to the nurse who saved her life. Standing there in the parking lot with my 3 patients, all of them healthy and thriving and pursuing meaningful lives, I felt something I had never quite felt before, a deep sense of completion and purpose that went beyond professional achievement. These weren't just patients I had treated. They were people whose entire futures had been hanging by a thread that night, and somehow I had managed to hold on to all 3 threads until help arrived. Ethan had gone on to publish multiple investigative pieces about emergency medical care and had exposed several other cases where healthcare workers had been put in impossible positions by administrative failures. His nonprofit had raised over $500,000 to fund trauma training programs in underserved communities, and he credited that night with giving him a new sense of purpose. He told me that lying on that gurney, bleeding out, hearing my voice commanding him to stay alive, had been a turning point where he realized he wanted to spend whatever life he had left making a difference. Linda had become something of a local celebrity in the cardiac care community, speaking at hospitals and community centers about her experience. She had connected with other heart attack survivors and created a support network that helped people navigate the emotional and physical recovery process. Her husband, the lawyer who had initially threatened legal action against the hospital, had instead worked with administration to develop better patient advocacy programs. Linda told me that she thought about me every single day and that the second chance I gave her had made her appreciate every moment with her family. Amber's story was perhaps the most dramatic of the three because her Olympic dreams had been so close to ending that night. She had been on her way home from a late training session when she collapsed from an undiagnosed heart condition that caused her respiratory arrest. If she'd been alone, or if I hadn't been able to intubate her quickly enough, she would have suffered permanent brain damage even if she survived. Instead, she had made a complete recovery, underwent treatment for her underlying condition, and was now training at the highest level of her sport. She showed me a photo of the custom running shoes she would wear at the Olympics, and there on the side in small letters was embroidered, "For Julia, who gave me wings." I completely broke down crying when I saw that, and all three of them hugged me right there in the parking lot, while hospital staff walked past, probably wondering what was happening. After they left, I sat in my car for a long time, just processing everything that had happened over the past year. I thought about that terrible night when I was alone in the ER with 3 dying patients and no doctor to help me. I thought about the fear I felt making decisions that could save lives or end them, knowing that either way I would face consequences. I thought about the moment when I realized Dr. Alex Hale had deliberately abandoned me, trying to engineer my failure and humiliation. And I thought about how all of that adversity had somehow transformed into this moment, where I was respected, empowered, and making a real difference in healthcare. The journey hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been fair, but it had proven something I had always believed deep down, that nursing wasn't just about following orders, it was about being a complete healthcare professional with knowledge, judgment, and courage. For too long, the medical system had treated nurses as assistants rather than clinicians, and that attitude had real consequences for patient care. What happened that night had exposed those consequences in the most dramatic way possible, and it had forced important conversations about how healthcare teams should really function. Over the following months and years, I continued to build on that foundation. The Emergency Nurse Practitioner Program expanded to include dozens of nurses across multiple hospitals, and outcomes data showed that patients treated by ENPs had equivalent or better results compared to traditional physician-only care. We published research papers demonstrating the effectiveness of nurse-led emergency interventions, and slowly but surely the medical establishment began to accept that maybe the old hierarchies needed to evolve. I also became involved in nursing education, teaching at the university level, and training the next generation of nurses to trust their knowledge and speak up when they saw something wrong. I told them the story of that night not to glorify what I did, but to emphasize that nursing required courage as much as competence. I told them that they would face doctors, administrators, and systems that tried to diminish their contributions, but that they needed to stay focused on what mattered, the patients who depended on them. Some of my students went on to become ENPs themselves, others became nurse researchers, educators, or administrators, but all of them carried forward the message that nurses were essential clinical professionals who deserved respect and autonomy. It was gratifying to see the culture changing, even if the progress was sometimes slower than I wanted. About 2 years after that fateful night, I received an unexpected letter from the American Nurses Association asking me to speak at their national convention about my experience and the changes it had catalyzed in emergency care. I accepted and found myself on stage in front of thousands of nurses from across the country, telling the story that had become central to my identity. I talked about the fear, the isolation, the impossible choices, and the moment when I realized that following protocol would mean watching people die. I talked about the aftermath, the investigation, the threat of losing my license, and then the unexpected transformation into recognition and reform. But most importantly, I talked about what it meant to be a nurse in a healthcare system that often undervalued nursing expertise. And I challenged my audience to push for the changes that our profession and our patients deserved. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of nurses came up to me afterward with their own stories of times they had been dismissed, ignored, or prevented from using their full clinical knowledge. They told me about doctors who refused to listen to their concerns until patients deteriorated, about administrators who prioritized cost-cutting over adequate staffing, about systems that treated them as interchangeable widgets rather than skilled professionals. Each story reinforced what I already knew, that what happened to me that night wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem in healthcare culture. But they also told me stories of change, of hospitals that were starting to value nursing input, of physicians who had learned to collaborate rather than command, of patients whose lives had been saved because a nurse was empowered to act. The movement I had accidentally started with one desperate night of unsanctioned interventions was growing into something much bigger, a genuine shift in how healthcare teams functioned and how different professionals related to each other. Not everyone was happy about these changes, of course. Some physicians felt threatened by the expansion of nursing roles and argued loudly that we were eroding patient safety and professional boundaries. Some administrators worried about liability issues and increased costs. Some nurses themselves were uncomfortable with taking on more responsibility and preferred the traditional model where doctors made all the decisions. Change is always controversial and always creates resistance. But the evidence was on our side, and gradually the momentum built toward a more collaborative and effective model of care. As for Dr. Alex Hale, I heard occasional updates about him over the years, and the story of his transformation was more complex than I initially expected. After his time at the community health clinic, he had apparently gone back to school to get additional training in emergency medicine, approaching it this time with genuine humility rather than arrogance. He published a remarkable paper in a medical journal about physician ego and how it contributed to medical errors and team dysfunction, using his own experience as a cautionary tale without naming me or the specific incident. The paper was widely read and discussed in medical education circles, and many people found his honest self-examination both brave and valuable. Some colleagues told me he had become a strong advocate for interprofessional collaboration and nurse empowerment, which felt ironic given our history. But I chose to see it as evidence that people really could change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. I never contacted him, and he never contacted me again after that night in the ER with his mother, and I thought that was probably for the best. Our story didn't need a reconciliation or a friendship. It just needed to end with both of us becoming better versions of ourselves and contributing positively to healthcare. He had learned that hierarchy without competence was dangerous, and I had learned that competence without authority could be just as problematic. Between us, we had helped push the profession toward a better balance. 5 years after that night, I was promoted to Director of Emergency Nursing for the entire hospital system, overseeing nursing practice at 4 different facilities and helping to shape policy for hundreds of nurses. It was a level of leadership I never imagined achieving, and it came with both opportunities and challenges. I had to navigate hospital politics, manage budgets, deal with difficult personalities, and make decisions that affected people's careers and livelihoods. It wasn't always comfortable, and I didn't always get it right, but I tried to lead with the same principles that had guided me that desperate night. Put patients first, trust your people's expertise, and have the courage to do what's right even when it's risky. I also got married during those years to a wonderful person I met through one of the trauma support groups Ethan had started. My spouse was a social worker who understood the intensity and unpredictability of healthcare work, and who supported my career ambitions without resentment or competition. We built a life together that balanced the demands of my job with personal happiness and stability, which was something I had struggled to achieve earlier in my career. Having that foundation of support at home made it easier to take risks and push boundaries at work, knowing I had somewhere safe to return to at the end of difficult days. Ethan, Linda, and Amber all stayed in my life in different ways over the years. Ethan and I collaborated on several projects related to emergency care education, and his journalism skills helped bring attention to important issues in healthcare policy. Linda became something of a surrogate mother figure to me, checking in regularly and always being there with advice or encouragement when I needed it. Amber did compete in the Olympics and won a bronze medal in the 800 meters, and she made sure I was there in the stands, watching when she did it. After the race, during her television interview, she told the world about the nurse who saved her life and gave her the chance to achieve her dreams, and my phone exploded with messages from people who had seen it. These 3 people had started as patients I saved in one desperate night, but they had become friends, advocates, and permanent reminders of why I did this work. They kept me grounded when the administrative responsibilities and political battles of my leadership role threatened to distance me from direct patient care. Whenever I felt overwhelmed or frustrated with bureaucracy, I would think about that night, about the weight of 3 lives depending entirely on my decisions, and about how grateful I was that I had been able to rise to that challenge. Nothing I faced in committee meetings or budget negotiations could ever be as intense as those hours alone in the ER, and that perspective helped me keep things in proportion. 10 years after that night, the hospital organized a reunion event bringing together everyone who had been involved in the incident and its aftermath. All 3 patients came, along with their families, as did Marcus, the transporter who had helped me, the paramedics who had arrived afterward, the backup resident who had confirmed my interventions, Dr. Patricia Morgan, who had made the decision not to punish me, and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by the story. It was overwhelming to see everyone in one room and to hear them talk about how that night had changed their perspectives on healthcare, teamwork, and what was possible in crisis situations. The hospital had also invited several people from the advanced practice nursing program I had been part of starting, and they shared data showing that over the decades since its creation, nurse practitioners in our system had performed thousands of emergency procedures with excellent outcomes and minimal complications. We had definitively proven that with proper training and support, nurses could safely expand their scope of practice in ways that benefited patients and healthcare systems. The evidence was undeniable, and even the most skeptical physicians had to acknowledge that the experiment had succeeded. During the event, they unveiled a plaque in the emergency department commemorating that night and recognizing the principle that patient care should always take precedence over hierarchy or protocol. The plaque read, "In recognition of the night of November 15th, when courage, competence, and compassion came together to save 3 lives and transform a system, may all who work here remember that the highest calling in healthcare is not following rules, but serving patients with everything we have." Below that was a quote attributed to me, though I couldn't remember saying it in exactly these words. When the choice is between breaking protocol and breaking your promise to save lives, choose to save lives every single time. As I stood there looking at that plaque with all those people around me, people whose lives had been changed by one terrible and wonderful night, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't known I was missing. The scared young nurse who had faced down impossible odds was still part of me, but she had been transformed by everything that followed into someone stronger, wiser, and more capable of making a difference. I thought about Dr. Alex Hale walking away from the ER that night, confident that I would fail and prove his assumptions about nurses right, I thought about how his plan had backfired so spectacularly, not because I was superhuman or because I got lucky, but because I refused to accept that titles mattered more than competence. I thought about the 3 people who had come into that ER dying and left it living, and about all the patients who had benefited in the years since from the changes their survival had catalyzed. And I thought about all the nurses who had been empowered, educated, and elevated because someone had finally forced the system to acknowledge what we had always known. That nursing expertise was real, valuable, and essential to excellent patient care. That night had been the worst and best of my career, a crucible that had tested everything I believed about myself and my profession. I had passed that test, but more importantly, I had used it as a catalyst to change things for everyone who came after me. The system was far from perfect, and there was still so much work to do, but we had made real progress, and I had played a central role in that progress. As the reunion event was winding down and people were saying their goodbyes, Ethan, Linda, and Amber pulled me aside one more time. They had a gift for me, a custom-made stethoscope with my name engraved on the chest piece, along with 3 dates, the birth dates of each of them, signifying that they had been reborn that night. Linda spoke for all 3 of them when she said, "Julia, you gave us our lives back, but you also showed us what it means to fight for what matters, even when the odds are impossible. We carry that lesson with us every day, and we wanted you to carry something that reminds you of what you accomplished and how many lives you've touched." I accepted the stethoscope with tears in my eyes, knowing I would treasure it for the rest of my career. That night, as I drove home, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. From those early days when I was just a new nurse trying to prove myself, through the years of watching doctors dismiss my input and limit my growth, to that terrible shift when everything came crashing down around me. I thought about the fear, the adrenaline, the impossible decisions, and the moment when I realized there was no help coming and I would have to save those 3 people myself or watch them die. I thought about the aftermath, the investigation, the terror of potentially losing my license, and then the unexpected turn toward recognition and reform. And I thought about the decade that followed, building something meaningful from that crisis, transforming one nurse's desperate struggle into a movement that changed how healthcare teams functioned. It hadn't been the path I planned or expected, but it had been exactly the path I needed. Dr. Alex Hale had tried to destroy me that night, but instead he had given me the opportunity to prove something that needed proving. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't even think about him much, because my focus was on the future rather than the past. The scared young nurse who had been abandoned in that ER was still part of me, but she had grown into someone who could lead, teach, and inspire others. And those 3 patients who had come in dying and left living had become the foundation of something much larger than any of us had imagined. So when people ask me about that night, about how I managed to save 3 lives alone without any doctor support, I tell them the truth. I tell them I was terrified. I tell them I broke rules and exceeded my authority. I tell them I made decisions that could have gone catastrophically wrong. But I also tell them I was prepared by years of experience and education, supported by colleagues like Marcus, who stepped up when needed, and guided by a simple principle that should be at the heart of all healthcare, that patients come first, always, no matter what protocols or hierarchies or egos get in the way. That night changed everything for me, for my 3 patients, for Dr. Alex Hale, and for countless nurses and patients who benefited from the reforms it sparked. It was the worst night and the best night, the most terrifying moment and the most defining moment, and I wouldn't change any of it. Because sometimes you have to break in order to rebuild, and sometimes you have to prove yourself under impossible circumstances in order to change a system that desperately needs changing. And sometimes the person who tries to destroy you actually gives you the greatest gift of your life, the chance to discover just how strong you really are. That's the story of the night Dr. Alex Hale abandoned me in the ER expecting me to fail, and how I saved 3 lives, changed a system, and discovered my own strength. It's a story about courage, competence, and the power of refusing to accept limitations that others try to impose on you. And it's a story with the best possible ending. Everyone who deserved to win did win. Everyone who deserved to learn did learn. And the patients who mattered most got to live and thrive and pursue their dreams. Justice really had never been this sweet.